want to focus now on the budget because very much a part of the political conversation. Going back again to what Ben Bernanke, the Fed chairman, said yesterday in front of the House Financial Services Committee.
After minimal gains in the first half of last year, real GDP increased at a 2.25% annual rate in the second half.
Michael Peterson, who is the vice chairman of the Peter G. Peterson Foundation in Politico, recently wrote, when President Obama released his budget Monday, everyone focused on the 10-year outlook on deficits. This is the same limited budget window that drove last year's Budget Control Act in the Super Committee. He wants to use a 25-year budget window. Joining us now, Michael Peterson, vice chair of the Peter G. Peterson Foundation. Thanks for being back on POTUS today.
Oh, good morning. Thank you for having me.
You know, we just heard Ben Bernanke. People are looking at the next year, first of all. And then, of course, as you mentioned, the 10-year budget for the president. A 25-year budget plan. Has this ever been attempted in this Congress? Or not just this Congress, but any Congress?
Well, listen, the standard outlook for budget windows is 10 years, and that's what's used by the president's budget, and that's what's used by CBO generally. But the reason we need to look out longer is that America faces long-term structural deficits that you really can't see when you only look out 10 years. And in my opinion, it's much easier to see a problem much easier to fix a problem when you can see it. And while debt to GDP increases significantly over the next 10 years, it really starts to grow explosively in the following 15 years.
In other words, in this budget or in any budget that's been proposed?
Well, pretty much any budget that looks out over the long term, you see, we're facing a major demographic shift. The baby boomers are retiring, and that's a huge swell in the retirees. They're living longer, and so they're spending more years in retirement. And then you multiply that times the increasing healthcare costs, and you see significant entitlement growth over the next several decades. So this is the long-term structural deficit, which in our view is the real threat to our future, and that's why you need to look out longer.
How much of it is those who are going to be retired and collecting Social Security? How much of the future deficit and debt problem is surrounding that?
Well, listen, it's driven almost entirely by entitlement growth based on the factors I said. Social Security is certainly part of the problem. The bigger problem is healthcare. Healthcare spending is growing exponentially across both the private and public sector, and the elderly consume disproportionate shares of healthcare spending in their later years. And that's the biggest fiscal challenge going forward is the increasing cost of healthcare growing much faster than GDP.
Well, this is the question I guess I'm getting to, is it a matter of where this country needs to have a discussion on philosophy as far as whether or not the government is going to be involved in Social Security and health care, or is it a matter of figuring out how, if indeed you say that the government needs to be more involved, then you need to have more revenues coming into the government to pay for the cost? I mean, is this a philosophical or just a fiscal argument?
Well, listen, there are many ways to solve this challenge. Last year, our foundation sponsored grants to 6 think tanks from across the political spectrum. And we actually had them look out 25 years, and they all solved it. And they did it in different ways, to be sure. But it can be solved in a variety of ways, but it needs to be addressed sooner rather than later. And you can address it with more revenue and lower spending, or you can do it just with spending, and we saw that across the plans. But the point is we got to start dealing with it sooner rather than later.
With a 25-year outlook that you've talked about, what can you consider fairly reliable projections? What can you use as, if not bedrock, at least something that you consider solid suppositions to your argument about what you're going to see 25 years from now as compared to today?
Well, I should say, listen, even though the 10 years is what gets all the attention and what all the focus is on, the president's budget does go out several decades. The CBO does project it, and I'm not saying we know exactly what's going to happen 30 years from now, but we know where we're headed, generally speaking, and we know how to fix it. I mean, the Simpson-Bowles Commission stabilized debt as a percentage of GDP over the long term. As I said, the plans we sponsored all solve that too. So you don't need exact precision on what's going to happen over the long term, and I'm not arguing we will have that. But, for example, most of the reforms to entitlements exempt people within 10 years of retirement. So even Paul Ryan's plan and the Simpson-Bowles plan exempted those nearing retirement in order to give them more time to prepare. So by definition, if you exempt people within 10 years of retirement, you see no savings within 10 years. And I don't know, in a political situation where fiscal reform is already quite difficult, I'm not sure how we can expect our leaders to implement reforms when they can't even show us savings because the window's so short. So I think it makes it even harder when they can't say, well, listen, here's the savings associated with this plan, and here's why we need to do it, because they're using this short window. So I think there's more and more people wanting to look at the long term.
I know if I go to the Peter G. Peterson Foundation, there's a nice chart there, the president's fiscal year 2013 budget. It has revenues projected 2012, 2022, spending, deficits, et cetera. Have you projected out what, if we were to continue the exact same spending levels we have right now, how much faster would our deficit grow, and how much greater would our debt be, or less? I haven't projected it.
Well,
have
all
you
right.
done an
So
analysis?
let me give you a few numbers. Okay, most economists look at debt as a percentage of the economy, or debt to GDP, and they argue that we shouldn't have debt to GDP greater than 60%, and they argue it's dangerous if it gets above 90%. So today we're
and
at
you
about
certainly
70.
don't want to get to the Greek level of 125%.
Correct. Right now we're at about 70%, so it's already quite high. If you take CBO's current policy projections, at the end of 10 years, it's about 94%. So that's already quite high. If you go out another 13 years, the number is 177% of GDP. So that's what I'm talking about. You don't need real precision to know whether it's 177 or 172 or 180, but you know going anywhere in that direction is going to lead to major fiscal and economic crises. So that's why I'm talking about this. The ensuing 10, 20, 30 years is where we see real challenges, and they can be addressed if you do it early.
So clearly, if nothing is done, then disaster awaits.
Yeah, it's just a matter of time. I mean, I think the real challenge for this country is it going to take a crisis in order for us to act? And we're working hard to ensure that we act sooner rather than later, before a crisis hits. To be sure, the investors will force change upon us at some point. We cannot just keep borrowing and borrowing for the next several decades on this current path. And if we do it slowly, gradually, with compassion and with prudence and with intelligence, we can deal with this problem over time. But if you wait till a fiscal and economic crisis, it's going to be much more painful for everybody involved.
Michael Peterson, Vice Chairman of the Peter G. Peterson Foundation, thank you for being here this morning.
Thank you for having me.